Hi friends, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I love to have you back here. And if you're new, I'm Stephanie and I love making videos about language learning, which is one of my biggest passions. And in this video, I want to cover vocabulary learning, and in particular, how can you learn vocabulary in a way that is actually effective and allows you to access that vocabulary whenever you feel like it, and it's also not going to bore you to death. Rule number 1. No flashcards. If you've seen my other videos, then you know I've mentioned in passing that I really don't like flashcards and I don't think that this is the way to go. But that is not all about flashcards. It's also about other types of rote memorization, such as going through word lists or dictionaries and stuff like that. And in this video, I want to dive in deeper into that because usually I only say that I don't think it works and I want to unpack why. So here's the thing. When you do this kind of rote memorization, it doesn't really stick in terms of being able to use it and in terms of going into your long-term memory. I'm sure many of us have had this, right? When you memorize things for an exam, so I'm sure it's happened to you as well. And then, once you memorize it, once the exam is done, okay, it's gone from the memory, whatever you memorized. So this type of memorization doesn't really help with long-term memory. And when I say memory, I mean that it doesn't really stick in your brain in a way that is accessible. Because if you've seen my video on memory, then you also know that I don't believe that memory has anything to do with language learning, at least not the type of active recall memory that we think has to do something with language learning. It doesn't. So if you want to know more about memory and language learning, you can go ahead and check out that video. But the memory I'm referring to here is the type of memory that means it's in you and you can access that word whenever you want and you can actually use it when you're speaking that language, which is not necessarily about conscious memory, it is about just knowing the word. So with rote memorization, what happens is that a lot of times the memory that it's in is kind of in the facts-based memory, the active recall memory, and then you need to do a lot of spaced repetition to make it work. And actually a lot of language learning is built around that, when you hear a lot of advice, a lot of apps, etc. But that doesn't help. It has nothing to do with the ability to speak the language or to even understand it. Because what happens when you're reading like a list of words, or when you're using flashcards, when you're doing spaced repetition, when you're studying the dictionary even, what happens is you are just remembering these isolated pieces of the language and you're figuring out what they mean. And you're not really seeing them in context. And that is extremely dangerous. Anything outside of context is, you have no idea how to use it. And then you need to do spaced repetition. Why is that a problem? Well, because it's an extremely boring activity. All of those activities that I mentioned that they don't work, not only do they not work, but they're so boring. And really, boredom is the first thing that's going to kill your language learning goals, because you cannot sustain language learning if you're bored. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So if you do something as tedious as flashcards, chances are you're going to dump it pretty quickly. And so that really is going to hamper your long-term progress. Don't believe me that, when you learn all of the words, you still don't speak the language? Well, let me give you an example. You can pause the video and Google the following name, or you can just Google it after. Nigel Richards. Who is that? Well, that's a man who learned all of the words of the French language. He basically memorized the dictionary, or at least that's what they say. Even if he didn't learn the whole thing, he learned pretty much almost every word. He probably knows more words in French than I do. And he does not speak French. He did that so he could play Scrabble. But he doesn't speak a word of French, even though he knows all the words. That is exactly what you're doing with flashcards. All you're doing is this rote memorization outside of context, which means you have no idea how to use that word. You have no idea about the nuance of that use being word in a sentence and the constructions that usually go around it and how it's usually used in speech. You don't get any of that color. All you get is, I don't know, being good at Scrabble. So yeah, even if you're great at this, even if you use all the fancy memory techniques and you memorize those flashcards and you memorize this dictionary, still, you're not going to be able to use the language, which is what language learning is all about. And you would have paid the cost of making language learning an extremely boring activity. And at the end of the day, the cost-benefit analysis just isn't there. There's just, you're paying too high of a price for remembering something that would be useful if you're memorizing like a set of facts that you needed to know, if you're memorizing a certain speech that you're gonna give, or if you're memorizing like a certain set of facts that you need to spit out during a presentation, or if you're preparing for an exam. By all means, use the fancy memory techniques, use flashcards, use whatever you want. But when it comes to building a skill, which language learning is, this isn't gonna help, as Nigel Richards proves. So how should you learn those words instead? Well, through context. That is how you should learn, through content. You pick interesting content that is relevant to your situation, and you learn words that way. You learn words through stories, through the content that you consume. That way you see the context in which words are used, you learn how to use them, you pick up some grammar along the way, because you can't help but notice patterns, especially if you've done this for a while and you're trained at picking up those things. So really, you pick up grammar rules, you pick up vocabulary at the same time. It's the best way to learn vocabulary, because you see all the different nuances of a word, because you know that one word can mean so many things. For example, the word rock, it can mean so many things, right? It can mean like music genre, it can mean in terms of like rock the boat, it can also mean like a piece of stone, it can mean to rock someone's world, for example. So many things, which if you saw it in a dictionary and you remember that laundry list of meanings, you wouldn't necessarily know which one to use, what it's about. But when you see it in context, you pick up all of those meanings that I was talking about, plus more. Which brings me to my next point, which is that you need multiple contexts. And that is exactly what you're going to get if you learn vocabulary through content, because the more content you consume, the number of contexts in which you see that word used. So you're able to use that word eloquently in speaking, you're able to see it in so many different forms and ways of using it, something that you would never get from a flashcard. And then you also, it's much better when it comes to sticking in your long-term memory, because when it comes to sticking in the long-term memory and that ability to just call it up when you need it and to just let it flow out of you when you're speaking, that is much easier when you're learning with stories, with content. And I love what Joseph Campbell says. He's certainly somebody that knows stories better than most of us. Well, he says that people may forget facts, but they remember stories. And he's so right. The human condition is stories. We tell each other stories. It's who we are. We just can't help it as a species. It's how we connect with each other and how we form our own identity based on the stories that we tell each other about ourselves, who we are, etc. And so the human brain is extremely well wired to stories, and that is how we have transferred wisdom for millennia, and it's also how we've transferred most of the knowledge, with the exception of the past few hundred years. It was through stories, it was mostly through oral tradition. And so the brain is extremely well wired to work with stories, to remember stories, to invent stories, etc. And through stories, through content, you can pick up words and you can pick them up much more easily that way, certainly in a much more fun manner, but also you're going to be able to use them later on and they're going to stick in the long-term memory much better than isolated words, which you may remember and then you kind of forget. Which actually begs the question, okay, well, when should I look up words? When I'm reading, when I'm listening, or when I'm watching a movie, etc. And really, there's only one rule here, and that it is not to look up every word. How often you look up words, it really depends. You can look it up every, 3 times or 5 times or something like that. You can make up some rule like that. Or you can look up a word in the case in which you would just not be able to understand what's going on unless you look up that word and you kind of miss the whole point of the story. Then you can look up a word, or alternatively, when you see it repeated so many times that you have to know it at this point. But usually, getting the words through context and just not looking up every single word, not interrupting the flow, is important in terms of picking up more knowledge and having more fun in general. If you want to know more about that, check out my video that I did on reading, on how to read, because I talk a lot in there about when to look up words, and that can easily be transferred to listening, to watching a movie, etc. Another tip when it comes to learning from content, from stories, is to focus on the story itself. Focus on the meaning of what is being told. Focus on the meaning of what you're listening to, reading, etc. This is what you should focus on rather than the individual words. And ironically, that is how you pick up the individual words much faster. Because really, when you're interested, the brain kind of does all of the work for you in the background. And when you're focused on the meaning, you're picking up the words used to convey that meaning, and you're not even realizing how that happened. Another tip that can truly help you is immersion, because when it comes to immersion, that can be extremely useful. Usually people say when you live in a foreign country, you can pick up a language very quickly, and that is because of immersion. Not everybody does. I actually know people that have lived abroad for years and still have not picked up the local language, so it is about being open, of course. Quite a big deal of it is just being open. But when it comes to picking up words through immersion, immersion is very important. So what I mean by that is that if you can engage many senses at the same time, that's going to imitate like a natural state of immersion, and it's going to help you retain the word better. And of course, this is self-explanatory. I don't think that many people would argue, but it doesn't matter whether you're like a visual or an auditory learner. Even if you're the most visual learner out there, if you look at certain paragraph, for example, and you listen to it at the same time, you're engaging two senses, and chances are you're going to learn better, you're going to learn more quickly. So especially in the beginning, when you don't really know the language well, I would advise, in terms of learning vocabulary, it would be super helpful to engage as many senses as you can. And if at this point you're thinking, okay, but I truly love flashcards, I truly love my lists, what do I do? It has worked for me. Well, in that case, I challenge you to think what has worked for you, and chances are most of the time what really works for us are phrases. So if you want to do some of those traditional things, if you truly love the system, if you actually don't find flashcards or this boring, then I recommend that you go for chunking. You know the way that we remember phone numbers? You know how when we say each individual number and we try to remember the whole thing, it doesn't really work, but when we group them in like sets of 2 or 3, we really can spit out the whole phone number much more easily. It is the same thing in language learning, and that is really helpful in order to kind of internalize the words. So you can do that. You can learn in chunks, basically. That's where the name of the term comes from. That is, you can learn phrases. When you learn phrases, it is much better than learning isolated words, because they're not like stories, they don't have the same effect, but still they are really good in terms that it's a whole phrase, and so you get how that word is used in a common phrase. And that is especially useful in the beginning, because in the beginning you might be super challenged to find simpler stories for beginners, especially for some languages. And in the very beginning, you do need to learn like a few words before you can dive into even the simpler stories. But I would certainly recommend to not learn a few words, but to learn a few phrases. Because as I said, that way you see the words actually in action in a phrase. It sticks much better in your memory, of course, just as the example with phone numbers. And then you also kind of pick up a little bit of a nuance of grammar, because usually the phrase is based on grammar rules and you're able to recognize some patterns. So learning phrases is amazing. And if you want to do flashcards, make them with phrases. So what about repetition? If you want to do something similar to spaced repetition, how do you do it? Here's how. When it comes to repetition and making sure that those things are kind of repeated enough so that they can stay in that long-term memory that I was talking about, that is kind of subconscious, and you can then access the words when you're speaking. Yeah, the way that can happen is you can reread the same story several times if you are not very bored with it. If you find that you're super bored with that, you just keep going. Keep reading, keep listening, keep watching videos. And then when you keep going, inevitably you're going to come across those words again, because most of our speech, we kind of use the same words all of the time. When it comes to fluency in a language, even the most fluent of us, even in your strongest languages, you're still kind of using the most common words. That is why some people suggest, memorize the 1,000 most common words in a language, which, as I said, bad idea, because out of context, they're not in phrases, whatever. But you do use mostly the most common 1,000 or 2,000 or however many words in a language. And if you don't want to do the type of repetition where you kind of read the same story a couple of times, certainly the more content you consume, the more you're going to come across those words. And that is kind of a natural repetition. And when you learn about the topics you care about, you're going to have this natural repetition of terms that are relevant to you, and you're going to pick a vocabulary that is relevant to you. And my last tip today is accept it takes time, because the faster you want to go, the slower you go. Unfortunately, when it comes to learning vocabulary, if you really push yourself, if you really kind of try to drill it in your head and memorize it, it can really create a negative effect. Usually this is well documented in studies, not just about language learning, about any types of learning, that the more negative feelings you have about it, like the more you're in a hurry and you're trying to force yourself, you're creating this kind of negative loop that just keeps going, and it really impedes your learning. So mood matters a lot in learning, and a lot of where that mood comes from is to accept that it takes time and to take it easy. The way that I always approach language learning is I never try to memorize anything. I just kind of do my thing, I go over my input, and then whatever sticks, sticks, whatever doesn't, it'll stick next time. So that is how I approach it, and it's always extremely stress-free, and I accept that it takes time, and it takes however long it's gonna take. I don't care, because it's a journey, and I'm enjoying the journey, and it's not so much about the end goal. And ironically, if you're very, very focused on the end goal and when you're going to be able to know the 5,000 most common words and when you're going to be able to speak fluently, ironically, if you kind of forget about that and you just live stress-free as if the deadlines don't matter, well, then it happens more quickly. So really, I cannot emphasize this enough. It's yeah, it's well documented, and it's one of those things that I think is one of the strongest discoveries that we've made, that truly learning is a lot about the psychological game, and it's really important to relax and to realize that if it doesn't happen today, it's going to happen tomorrow. So just keep going, and yeah, just accept the limitations. Know that if you are learning a language that is very, very different from your own, chances are that it's going to take more time. And if you're learning a language from the same language family, then probably you're going to pick up the vocabulary much faster. That's just, you know, there's no way around that. So accept it, and it's going to help you quite a lot. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any specific questions in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe to see more from this type of videos. If you want to be the first one to know when I upload, then ring the notification bell. And I will see you here very soon with the next topic. And until then, I wish you a wonderful day or evening. Bye bye.